To whoever may read this, the following is an account of some of the melancholy events that have befallen me in my dark, tinged lifetime in my own words. I hope that some of you may, for a moment, put aside the pressures and events in your lives that may have some actual importance and listen as I recount the tale of my life, in particularly my life in so far as it relates to a certain devil house which once constituted my family's estate. It's a grim tale, and not for those weak of stomach or depressed by nature. Before I begin, I suppose I must give you some information on whose life you're about to see in audio. I'm 25, a field writer, and somewhat of an English scholar. I say somewhat as I never finished formal education, or at least not as much as I really should have. I now find myself as a failed writer and a journalist who hates his job. I will not use my name in this story for fear someone may use it in order to find me, and therefore the horror which I will now die attempting to keep from the world. When I was a child, I lived in a small thatched cottage in rural Devonshire, England. It's an old, eerie house, the type that would look quite at home in some cheesy horror story. During the autumn and winter, thunderstorms were common in my area, and on a dark night with the wind howling, the rain belting, and lightning chipping away at the surrounding mountainous countryside, it could be quite a sight. It was also a strange old place, the sort of house where you would wake up early in the morning with your heart thumping and beads of sweat streaming down your face onto your soaked sheets without any memories of a nightmare or any sign of what could have woken you. The sort of house where you could be alone in a room, but even if you lock and bolt the doors, you would find yourself subconsciously glimpsing over your shoulder, as if the very walls were sprouting unseen eyes and watching you. There was always a certain malice about the place. You never truly felt alone. It was never a place I could call home, but I don't think I was the only one. The house seemed to reject any sentient life that dared step foot into its dank rooms. It made you feel unwelcome by projecting its own darkness onto whoever entered it, as if left tainted by the hateful heart of some previous deceased owner. We knew nothing of the house's history, with my parents having only purchased it in the early 50s. We had no significant contact with the house's previous owners other than to exchange money and legal papers. So when my father and mother, who was pregnant with me at the time, moved in, they knew nothing of the place, but we could always tell it was old. I don't know how old enough to have seen a lot in its time. There may well have been a whole village there when it was first built, but now there was only the house and the desolate countryside that stretches out for miles each side. There it stands like a sentinel, standing erect in that untouched area of countryside, keeping its cold watch, ready to stop anything from touching its strange serenity. But there was also something meek and pathetic about the house, like it was the last survivor of some near apocalyptic event in which all its brethren was wiped out, now doomed to stand its lonely vigil until its very earth gave way beneath it, sad, alone, weak, with a crooked old heart filled with hate. I believe my poetic side is reading too far into it, so I'll stop boring you with my romanticizing and instead get to the bulk of my tale. I lived in that house for the first 18 years of my life with my mother, a quiet and nurturing woman, my father, a rather traditional English gentleman. He commuted to the small village a few miles away where he worked in the isolated village's bank. I also had a younger sister who was 8 when she vanished. My sister disappeared from my family home on the 4th of November, 1970. I was only 10 myself when it happened. I don't remember the details exactly of what happened. I only remember that one day she was there, and the next day she was gone, leaving nothing but a distraught mother and a numb father to prove that she'd ever been there at all. My parents called the police at the payphone in the village, because after a particularly brutal storm the week before knocked out the phone lines. At that time there was no internet, and I still can't figure out how we even had electricity and a phone line. The search went on for weeks after she disappeared, but nobody was ever recovered. The police had given up the search, reasoning that she had run off during the night for some childlike adventure those young ones raised in rural environments tend to go on, and had fallen or gotten lost. There had been heavy rain and decent wind speeds on the night she disappeared, so it wasn't hard to imagine a young girl running through a wet, rocky area in pitch black, tripping and breaking her neck or falling down into some crevice. The police knew there was no hope of finding her alive, and this was long before the time of Facebook missing person campaigns. So the police stopped the search in the knowledge that they would be doing by sending more officers into a secluded rocky area in harsh conditions would be risking more lives. So my sister was essentially classed as missing and presumed dead. Although I might not remember the events surrounding her disappearance, what certainly stuck in my head were these leading up to and the aftermath of her disappearance. My parents took her disappearance harder than I did. I was too completely young to comprehend what was going on, and neither of my parents felt like explaining it to me. All I understood was that Sal was gone, and now Mommy and Daddy are sad. My mother took it the hardest of all. She had clearly always wanted a daughter, and my sister had been extremely close to her, following her around almost everywhere. It didn't take long for my mother's mental state to deteriorate to a startling degree after my sister's apparent death. She completely withdrew into herself. She never spoke to anyone, not even my father, yet sometimes I would hear her talking though, but not to any person. To my young mind, it almost sounded like she was, well, talking to the walls. Like she and the house were engaged in some deeply private conversation in hushed tones. What really stands out in my memory today is the fact that I could hear two distinctly different voices. At the time, I assumed that she was either speaking with my father or talking in funny voices. I mean, at the time, I saw nothing wrong with this. In retrospect, however, neither of these two things could be true, with my father apparently always having an alibi, and the fact that that voice could not possibly have been my mother's. Not only was it in a completely different frequency, it also didn't sound human. And I know that sounds cliche, but by inhuman I don't mean it was some deep guttural growl of some demon or animal. There was something pure yet scratchy about its voice. The closest thing I could compare it to is the noise thick foliage makes when a strong wind blows. Something between a whistle and a scream. Only a year after my sister's disappearance, my mother also vanished late on an October night. The investigation was short with the obvious, be it brutal verdict that she had slipped out in the middle of the night without any intention of returning. There are many caves, hills, and streams in the surrounding area a person could use to quietly take their life and never be found. My father became cold and distant after my mother's death. He was hit hard by my sister's death, but now with the loss of mother, he felt he had nothing to live for. I could tell he still cared for me and did not act distant to hurt me. My father was an honor-bound man. There was no way he was going to take his own life, but at the same time, he had no hope. Everything he had ever loved and tried to protect had been taken away from him in the course of 1 year. He never turned to alcohol or quit his job. He never left the house and lived in it every remaining day of his life. He just stayed in his own honor-bound limbo until he died 20 years later. Once I hit 18, I left to make my own way in life. Although I wanted to be there for them, I sensed he didn't really want me there. And so, I lived a normal life. I got a decent job as a mechanic and bought myself a decent-sized bungalow in a small town in Hampshire. I lived well, but not in luxury. I then discovered my father had passed away aged 64, leaving the house and what humble possessions he had left to me. After I left home, me and my father had never patched up our relationship. In fact, I hadn't spoken with him in about 11 years, and had only found out about his death when I was approached about his will. I had over time blocked out the events of my childhood, not even because I found them traumatizing, but more because I thought them to be unimportant, particularly when I was younger. The moment I heard about my father's death, all the memories, many with new detail and context the older me could pick out, came flooding back. At that moment, something happened. I was not filled with some strange curiosity, some urge to go back there. I was not suddenly aware of some great truth I had left unseen. Not even the lightest flame of interest was ignited in my heart. I quickly, quietly, and above all, simply, lost the ability to live a normal life. I can't explain it. It wasn't something understood by my higher thought processes. I simply could no longer continue with my endless, dull routine of work, eat, sleep. I found myself unable to focus on any of these activities. I found it especially hard to do them in any order, uninterrupted. I was just accompanied everywhere by this nagging sense of insecurity following me through life, and this continuous, subconscious feeling that returning to the side of my family members' deaths would somehow ease my mind. I was not sure that it would, and I wasn't nervous about doing it either. It was just a vague hope, but a necessary one. I hope that in the end became just as nagging as to the problem to which it's supposedly the solution. I eventually decided to claim a few weeks of work to visit the home, if I can even call it that, I grew up in.